Diary excerpt. When a soul is far from God, its heart is heavy and it falls into despair. Yet it is not the sin itself that pushes the soul into darkness, but the refusal to turn back to God with trust. It is this resistance to divine mercy that deepens the soul's torment. Diary 1493. Have you ever felt as though you were slipping not into sin, but into something deeper, something that felt more like spiritual fatigue than outright rebellion? Have you ever wondered how a soul can stray so far from God without even realizing the full cost of that separation? And have you ever noticed how the smallest missteps, when left unchecked, can slowly lead the soul away from the light? Saint Faustina, through the revelations of Jesus, was shown the profound consequences of sin, not simply as acts of disobedience, but as gradual steps away from God that the soul takes when it becomes unaware of its own peril. She was shown how these sins, often veiled in seemingly harmless actions or thoughts, gradually draw the soul toward darkness, making it harder and harder to return to the light. In her diary, Faustina speaks of how Jesus revealed to her that certain sins, although they may appear insignificant on the surface, are like silent chains that bind the soul. The soul does not always feel the weight of these chains immediately. It continues to walk, thinking it is still moving toward God, yet with each unrepented sin, it drifts further from Him. The first sin Jesus revealed to Faustina that drags a soul toward darkness is the sin of pride. Pride is not always overt. It often disguises itself as self-sufficiency, or even as a quiet confidence. A soul that refuses to acknowledge its need for God, believing it can stand alone, slowly loses sight of God's mercy. The more it relies on itself, the further it moves from God's grace, and the deeper it falls into the shadow of its own arrogance. Faustina was shown that pride is a deadly sin because it blinds the soul. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It quietly says, "You don't need help. You are fine the way you are." And with every little whisper of pride, the soul becomes less aware of God's presence in its life. The more the soul relies on its own strength, the more distant it becomes from God's light. The second sin Jesus revealed to Faustina is the sin of unrepented sin. Faustina writes that when a soul repeatedly refuses to confess its sins or acknowledge its wrongdoings, it closes itself to God's mercy. This rejection of reconciliation is a slow process, one that can go unnoticed for years. Over time, the soul becomes numb to its own guilt, and it begins to justify its actions, convincing itself that it is not truly at fault. Jesus showed Faustina that this sin is a subtle one. It does not happen with a loud refusal to repent, but rather with a quiet complacency towards sin. The soul may attend Mass, pray the Rosary, and continue its religious duties, but its heart remains closed to the transformative power of confession. The longer this sin goes unrepented, the further the soul drifts from God's mercy, until it is surrounded by darkness without even realizing it. As Faustina knelt in prayer, reflecting on the revelations Jesus had shown her, she felt a deep sorrow for the souls that wandered unknowingly toward darkness. She understood that the enemy's greatest weapon is not an overt attack, but the subtle, gradual separation from God that happens when the soul grows indifferent to sin. Jesus had shown her that some sins were not immediately destructive, but instead were like small leaks that, over time, could flood the heart and drown it in despair. The third sin Jesus revealed to Faustina was the sin of ingratitude. She had written many times in her diary about the importance of gratitude, how it was the key that unlocked God's mercy. But Jesus also revealed to her that a soul that forgets to be grateful, that takes the gifts of life and grace for granted, gradually loses its connection to God. Gratitude opens the heart to God's love, while ingratitude closes it. The more the soul becomes ungrateful, the less it acknowledges God's goodness, and the more it drifts into darkness. In her reflections, Faustina thought about the many small graces she had received in her life, moments of peace, quiet inspiration, the love of her sisters, and how easy it was to overlook them in the busyness of daily life. Jesus had shown her that ingratitude doesn't just manifest as a lack of thanksgiving. It manifests in the way the soul stops recognizing the small, ordinary ways in which God is present. It is the soul that forgets to give thanks for the simple things that begins to take them for granted. slowly dulling its awareness of God's presence. The fourth sin Jesus revealed to Faustina was the sin of gossip and judgment. This sin was particularly dangerous because it poisoned the soul from within, corrupting not just the one who spoke, but also the one who listened. Jesus showed Faustina that a soul that speaks ill of others or judges their actions harshly builds a wall between itself and God. The soul becomes obsessed with the faults of others, and in doing so, turns its gaze away from its own need for grace. Gossip is not always malicious, but it always spreads darkness. It may begin with a harmless comment or a casual conversation, but it soon festers into judgment, bitterness, and resentment. Faustina felt Jesus' sorrow as he revealed to her how often souls become entangled in gossip without realizing the harm it causes. It starts innocently, with words that seem harmless, but as the soul becomes more accustomed to speaking ill of others, it hardens its heart toward compassion. The soul begins to see others through the lens of judgment rather than mercy, and in doing so, it pulls itself further away from God's love. Judgment, Faustina understood, is a silent sin that consumes the soul, turning it inward and away from the light of God's mercy. Finally, the fifth sin Jesus revealed to Faustina was the sin of spiritual sloth, or laziness in the spiritual life. This sin was particularly dangerous because it often goes unnoticed. Faustina wrote that a soul's greatest temptation is not always external distractions, but the inner laziness that makes it unwilling to engage fully in the life of grace. A soul that becomes spiritually lazy stops praying with sincerity, stops seeking God's will, and stops trying to grow closer to Him. Instead, it drifts along, doing the bare minimum, without truly committing itself to God's service. Jesus explained to Faustina that spiritual sloth was a slow poison, one that deadens the soul over time. At first, it may seem like nothing more than fatigue or a lack of enthusiasm, but it gradually steals the soul's joy and fervor. The soul that becomes spiritually lazy forgets that God has given it a mission, a purpose, and the grace to fulfill it. And when the soul stops striving to live fully in God's love, it begins to fade into darkness. After receiving these revelations, Faustina moved through her ordinary duties with a weight on her heart that felt both sorrowful and purposeful. She realized that the sins Jesus had shown her were not rare dramatic actions, but everyday failures that, if left untended, could gradually darken the soul. She felt an urgent responsibility, not to condemn, but to understand, to pray, to intercede. One afternoon, while scrubbing the convent floor on her hands and knees, Faustina felt interiorly that Jesus wanted her to contemplate the path a soul takes once it begins to fall into these 5 sins. It is not a sudden collapse, it is a slow drift. Pride takes away humility. Unrepented sin takes away peace. Ingratitude takes away awareness of grace. Gossip takes away charity. Spiritual sloth takes away zeal. And step by step, without realizing it, the soul loses the light it once carried so naturally. Faustina paused, resting her hands on the wet floor, and allowed her heart to listen. Jesus showed her that the soul does not fall into darkness because it chooses evil. It falls because it stops choosing good. 100 small refusals, 100 quiet compromises, 100 opportunities ignored. Darkness does not seize the soul violently. It settles like dust, imperceptible at first, until the soul is covered in it. She remembered a moment described in her diary when she sensed how easily a soul could become blind to its own spiritual state. A soul that is proud and self-confident closes itself to grace, she wrote. The proud soul cannot see its faults. The ungrateful soul cannot see its blessings. The slothful soul cannot see its purpose. This blindness becomes a chain, binding the soul even when it believes it is still walking freely. Later that evening, Faustina walked to the garden behind the convent. The sun was low, painting the sky in deep oranges and golds. A soft wind carried the scent of earth and leaves. She stood still, feeling the gentle silence, and Jesus revealed something that pierced her deeply. The 5 sins he had shown her were not simply moral failures, they were ruptures in the soul's relationship with him. Pride ruptures trust, unrepented sin ruptures intimacy. Ingratitude ruptures awareness, gossip ruptures charity, Spiritual sloth ruptures devotion. This was the true danger. Not the sins themselves, but what they removed from the soul. Light, tenderness, truth, purpose, love. A soul can survive weakness, but it cannot survive the loss of relationship. Without relationship, the spiritual life becomes hollow, mechanical, and cold. Faustina felt her heart ache as she prayed for souls who were drifting unknowingly toward this darkness. She saw that the soul does not need to commit great sins to lose its way. It only needs to stop caring, stop watching, stop loving. Indifference is the quiet assassin of holiness. And once it enters, the soul begins to walk toward darkness as naturally as a shadow grows in the fading light. But she also sensed hope, strong, unwavering hope. Jesus had shown her these sins, not to crush the soul with fear, but to awaken it, to remind it that darkness can be reversed the moment the soul turns back toward mercy. She whispered softly, "Lord, do not let any soul remain asleep in darkness." That night, long after the convent had settled into its habitual stillness, Faustina remained awake in her small cell. The moonlight slipping through the window cast a pale glow across the wooden floor, and the silence around her seemed almost alive, breathing, attentive, waiting. She could not sleep. The weight of the 5 sins Jesus had revealed pressed on her soul with a kind of holy urgency. It was not anxiety, it was responsibility. She knew these truths were not for her alone. As she knelt beside her bed, the cool floor pressing gently against her knees, Jesus drew near once more, and with a tenderness that softened even her deepest fears, he allowed her to see the consequences of these sins when they are left unchecked. Not the dramatic punishments people often imagine, but something far more subtle and far more dangerous. The first consequence Jesus showed her was spiritual numbness. A soul stained by pride stops feeling its need for grace. A soul with unrepented sin stops feeling remorse. A soul steeped in ingratitude stops feeling joy. A soul consumed by gossip stops feeling compassion. A soul drowning in sloth stops feeling desire for holiness. The soul no longer feels, not sorrow, not longing, not tenderness, only a quiet interior deadness that grows slowly, silently, almost peacefully, like a winter creeping across the heart. Faustina felt this numbness like a heavy veil pressing upon her. She understood how frightening it was, not because it felt dramatic, but because it felt like nothing at all. And nothing is the enemy's favorite tool. A soul that feels nothing stops fighting, stops rising, stops caring. The second consequence Jesus revealed was isolation from grace, not because God withdraws, but because the soul stops responding. The proud soul no longer hears God's invitations. The unrepentant soul no longer recognizes his voice. The ungrateful soul no longer sees his gifts. The judgmental soul no longer feels his compassion. The slothful soul no longer follows his inspirations. Grace still knocks, still calls, still surrounds, but the soul becomes deaf to it. Faustina pressed her forehead into her hands as she felt the sorrow of this truth. She saw how many souls drift into darkness simply because they stop listening. Not because they want darkness, but because they slowly grow blind to the light. The third consequence Jesus showed her was the distortion of truth inside the soul. Pride whispers, "You're fine as you are." Unrepented sin whispers, "There's nothing to confess." Ingratitude whispers, "You deserve more." Gossip whispers, "You are better than others." Sloth whispers, "There is no hurry to grow." These whispers begin to replace the voice of God. The soul begins to believe them, and once it believes lies, darkness follows naturally. Faustina felt tears slip down her cheeks. She realized how fragile a soul becomes when truth is replaced by self-deception. It loses its compass. It no longer knows where it is or where it is going. But in that moment of sorrow, Jesus whispered something that filled her with hope, as gentle as a breath and as powerful as dawn breaking over the horizon. "No soul falls so far into darkness that my mercy cannot lift it." She lifted her face slowly, the tears drying on her skin, her heart beating with renewed confidence. The following morning, Faustina stepped into the courtyard just as the first light of dawn began to touch the convent walls. A thin mist rested over the garden, and the air smelled of dew and earth. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stood still, feeling the gentle tremor of the revelation still echoing within her. The 5 sins Jesus had shown her were not distant abstractions. They were the daily battles that shaped the journey of every soul. As she watched the sun begin to rise, Jesus illuminated another profound truth. These sins grow not from malice, but from forgetfulness. Forgetfulness of who God is, forgetfulness of His mercy, forgetfulness of His tenderness, forgetfulness of His presence in the smallest moments. This forgetfulness becomes a quiet door through which darkness enters unnoticed. Faustina closed her eyes and let the light warm her face. She understood that the soul falls into pride when it forgets its dependence on God. It falls into unrepented sin when it forgets the sweetness of reconciliation. It falls into ingratitude when it forgets the gifts hidden in each moment. It falls into gossip when it forgets the dignity of every soul. It falls into spiritual sloth when it forgets the urgency of love. The forgetfulness is subtle. It begins as distraction, as busyness, as preoccupation with earthly concerns. And slowly the soul drifts. Jesus showed her that the descent into darkness often begins with nothing more than a soul forgetting to pray with the heart, forgetting to guard its thoughts, forgetting to choose love in small things. As she walked toward the chapel, the gravel crunching beneath her feet, she felt the weight of another truth. Every sin that drags the soul toward darkness creates a wound within it. Pride wounds humility. Unrepented sin wounds trust. Ingratitude wounds joy. Gossip wounds charity. Spiritual sloth wounds zeal. These wounds bleed slowly, quietly, weakening the soul's vitality until it barely remembers the brightness it once knew. Faustina entered the chapel and knelt before the tabernacle. The sanctuary lamp flickered softly, its glow reflecting in her eyes. Jesus allowed her to sense the sorrow of souls living with these wounds, souls who longed for God but felt too far, too numb, or too ashamed to return. She felt their heaviness, their confusion, their longing for healing. In that moment, Jesus' voice filled her heart, gentle yet unwavering. It is not the wound that destroys the soul, but its refusal to let me heal it. Faustina trembled, overwhelmed by the truth of those words. Healing begins the moment the soul turns back to God, even if only with a whisper. One act of trust can break the chains of pride. One sincere confession can shatter years of unrepented sin. One act of gratitude can restore the soul's vision of grace. One moment of charity can silence the voice of judgment. One step of effort can revive spiritual zeal. The soul does not need perfection to return, only willingness. As she rose from prayer, the morning sunlight fully illuminated the chapel. The shadows fled, and within her heart, Faustina felt a certainty brighter than the dawn. No sin, no darkness, no weakness has the power to keep a soul from God once it decides to turn toward His mercy. That evening, when the convent grew quiet and the long corridors were touched only by the dim glow of lanterns, Faustina returned to the chapel as if drawn by an unseen thread. The sanctuary lamp flickered gently, casting warm ripples of light across the floor, like reflections on a river. She knelt, her body still, her soul alert, and Jesus allowed her to understand the deepest truth hidden within the 5 sins that drag the soul toward darkness. The true tragedy is not the sin itself, but the distance it creates between the soul and God. Every sin, no matter how small, creates a shadow in the heart, but Jesus showed her that darkness does not win through a single fall. It wins through the soul's gradual refusal to return. Pride becomes a refusal to kneel. Unrepented sin becomes a refusal to confess. Ingratitude becomes a refusal to notice grace. Gossip becomes a refusal to love. Sloth becomes a refusal to rise, and each refusal deepens the distance. Faustina felt her heart ache as she sensed how many souls live in that distance without realizing how far they have wandered. They pray but without fire. They serve but without love. They believe but without intimacy. Their spiritual life becomes mechanical, hollow, dim. not because they rejected God outright, but because they slowly stopped responding to him. Jesus then revealed something to Faustina that shook her with both fear and consolation. The soul that lives in darkness often believes it is still in the light. This, he showed her, is the most dangerous consequence of the 5 sins. Pride blinds the soul to its weakness. Unrepented sin numbs the soul to its guilt. Ingratitude blinds the soul to its blessings. Gossip blinds the soul to its cruelty. Sloth blinds the soul to its calling. The soul can walk deeper into darkness while believing it is walking toward God. Faustina lowered her head, trembling at the subtlety of this deception. She saw how easily the world falls into such darkness, not through rebellion but through distraction, comfort, self-justification, and spiritual apathy. And yet, even in the depths of this revelation, she felt a warmth rising in her soul, a warmth that told her that darkness is fragile compared to mercy. Jesus whispered gently within her, "One moment of sincerity can shatter a lifetime of darkness." The words settled into her heart like embers igniting into flame. A single act of truth, a single confession, a single step of humility, a single "Jesus, I trust in you" can break the chains forged by years of sin. The love of God is not hesitant. It rushes, it pursues, it restores, and no distance created by the soul is too far for God to cross in an instant. As she remained kneeling, Faustina felt an overwhelming desire to intercede for souls trapped in these 5 sins. She prayed for the proud to be humbled by love, for the unrepentant to be moved by sorrow, for the ungrateful to be awakened by grace, for the judgmental to feel compassion, and for the spiritually slothful to be stirred by divine longing. She rose slowly, the chapel bathed now in gentle darkness, except for the unwavering glow of the sanctuary lamp. That single flame reminded her of the truth Jesus had pressed into her soul. No matter how thick the darkness becomes, even the smallest light, if protected, if chosen, if trusted, can guide the soul home. She whispered softly, "Jesus, bring every soul back to your mercy."